The first snow always comes quietly in northern Vermont. No thunder, no warning. Just the slow hush of white beginning to fall over everything that once had a voice. By the time the flakes reach the frozen lake, they already sound like silence. Elliot Crane sits by the window, a cup of coffee, long gone cold, in his hand. He doesn't drink it anymore. He just holds it for the warmth, as if it were a heartbeat he could borrow for a while. The house has grown smaller since Margaret passed, not because the walls have moved, but because the air doesn't travel the way it used to. Back when she was alive, even the quiet was alive, full of small sounds, the hum of her humming, the creak of her rocking chair, the whisper of knitting needles clicking together like two old friends still finishing a conversation. Now, it's only the clock on the mantel that dares to speak. Tick, tick, tick. Each sound feels like a reminder that time still believes in moving forward. Even when he doesn't, he sometimes catches himself talking to her. Not in the way of ghosts, but in the way of habit, the small murmurs that come from years of love and routine. Margaret. Did I leave the stove on, Margaret? You'd laugh if you saw the mess I made of that chair leg. Then the answer never comes. And the silence answers for her. Her boots are still by the door, dusted now with sawdust instead of snow. He couldn't put them away. It felt too much like closing the door to a room he might still need someday. Her knitting basket rests beside the armchair, where the light always fell just right in the afternoons. There's a half-finished scarf in it, sky blue, with one loose thread hanging like a forgotten thought. Sometimes Elliot touches that thread and wonders if finishing it would help, or hurt worse. He never finds an answer. Outside, the lake lies under a glassy sheet of ice. It looks like stillness made visible. He used to take Margaret skating there when they were young. She'd always fall once, on purpose, just to make him laugh. Now he can't look at the ice without feeling it crack somewhere inside him. Evenings are the hardest, when the sky fades and the trees turn into black shapes against the white. He feels the weight of everything she took with her, the sound of her laughter, the smell of her cinnamon tea, the rhythm of her breath when she read before bed. Grief isn't loud anymore. It used to be, but after a year, it becomes something else, like a soft fog that lives in the lungs, never choking, but never clearing. He keeps the radio off. He says it's because the reception's bad out by the lake. But truthfully, music hurts. Every melody reminds him of what used to fill this house: warmth, noise, purpose. Now it's just him. The creaking floorboards, and the whisper of wind slipping through the chimney like an old visitor too polite to knock. When he goes to bed, he still turns to her side of the mattress. He doesn't sleep there, he just looks at it. Sometimes, the dent of her pillow seems to rise again under the moonlight. He knows it's just the shadow of the curtain, but it's a kind lie, and he's learned to accept kind lies. He doesn't tell anyone how lonely he is. There's no one left nearby to tell. The neighbors from the next cabin moved south last year. His daughter writes from Boston. Busy, kind, full of good intentions. She always ends her letters with, "You should get a dog." Dad, for company, he smiles at that, a soft, sad smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. What she doesn't understand is that the heart can't open its door again just because someone suggests it. It needs a reason. It needs a knock from the outside. Most nights, Elliot stays up past midnight, just listening to the wind push against the eaves, listening to the ice on the lake groan and settle, listening to the echo of what used to be a home. Sometimes, He imagines he hears her, the soft thud of her feet in slippers. The kettle beginning to whistle. He closes his eyes, lets the thought breathe, and then lets it go. Because grief, he's learned, is just love with nowhere to go. He looks around the room, the wood walls, the mantel full of old pictures, the small oil lamp she bought at a yard sale 30 years ago. In one photo, she's laughing, snowflakes tangled in her hair. He's behind her, pretending to complain but secretly smiling. He remembers the smell of that winter pine and cold air, and her perfume faint as memory. Tonight, the fire burns low. He thinks about adding more wood, but he doesn't. Let the flames die when they want to. Everything else already has. Through the frost on the window pane, he watches the snow drift sideways under the porch light. It looks peaceful from inside. Beautiful. Even. But he knows how cruel it can be once the wind starts, how it erases footprints, fences, and the small signs that someone once lived there. He whispers softly into the dim room. When someone you love leaves, the world doesn't end. It just gets quieter, too quiet to bear. His voice barely stirs the air. The clock ticks once more, as if to answer. Outside, the snow continues falling. The lake, the trees, the cabin, all folding under its weight, all swallowed in white. And somewhere in that silence, between one heartbeat and the next, the story begins to turn, though he doesn't know it yet. Something small is moving toward him through the storm. Something breathing. Something alive. But for now, there is only the empty cabin and the man who waits inside it, holding on to warmth that isn't really there. In a world that keeps pretending to be still, the night deepens. The last ember in the hearth flickers once, then goes dark, and the snow, the quiet, endless snow keeps falling. It was near midnight when Elliot first heard the sound. A faint, irregular scratching at the porch door, too light to be a branch, too persistent to be the wind. He thought for a moment that he was imagining it. The mind, when lonely, too long, begins to invent company. But the sound came again, hesitant, patient, and real. Elliot rose from his chair. The fire had died down to a red whisper, and the house had that stillness it gets just before snow deepens. He pulled on his flannel robe, each step creaking the floorboards that hadn't known another pair of feet in almost a year. When he opened the door, the cold rushed in like a memory sharp, alive, almost personal. And there, crouched on the porch, was a small dog. Its fur was matted with frost, patches of white and gray tangled together, like the sky and the snow had forgotten where one ended. It looked up at him with eyes the color of morning ice blue, distant and waiting. No bark, no sound, just the shiver of a creature that had run out of places to go. Elliot's first thought was to close the door, not out of cruelty, out of fear, because kindness, he knew, has a way of breaking the fragile walls we build around pain, and he had just begun to live safely behind his. He looked at the animal, saw the ribs moving under its fur, the small steam of breath rising and fading. He sighed, the kind of sigh that comes not from decision but from surrender. All right, he muttered, voice rough with sleep and something else. Just for the night. He went to the hallway closet, pulled out an old quilt Margaret had sewn years ago, faded red squares, edges fraying. He laid it by the stove and stepped back. The dog hesitated, then limped forward, its paws soundless on the worn floor. It circled once, twice, then sank down with a soft exhale. As if it finally believed in warmth again, Elliot sat back in his chair. The wind scratched at the windows, but inside, a different kind of silence settled, not the empty one that haunted him, but a living quiet. The kind that breathes. He watched the animal's chest rise and fall. The fur was still damp. Melting snow, forming tiny puddles on the quilt. For a while, he just stared, trying to remember the last time another living being had shared this space with him. Margaret's voice drifted from somewhere deep inside memory. Everything that finds you in winter, Elliot, comes for a reason. Nothing wanders to your door by mistake. He swallowed hard and looked away. He wanted to argue with the voice to say he didn't need reasons anymore. Didn't need company. Didn't need the ache that follows both. But when he turned back, the dog's eyes were already closed, lashes crusted with frost. It slept as if it trusted him, and that, somehow, hurt the most. Elliot reached out slowly, brushing a bit of snow from its back. The fur beneath was softer than he expected, warm under the ice. He whispered, "You're a stubborn one. Aren't you coming out here in the middle of nowhere?" He looked toward the window, snow falling thick now, steady as breath. "Guess I shouldn't talk," he said quietly. "I'm the same." Hours passed. The fire dimmed, then flared as he added another log. Every now and then the dog stirred, stretching, letting out small sounds that filled the air like forgotten music. Elliot dozed in his chair, and for the first time in months, he wasn't afraid of falling asleep. When morning came, the light slipped through the frost-glazed glass in long, pale ribbons. Elliot woke to the sound of claws tapping gently against the wood. The dog stood at the door, tail wagging once, hesitantly, as if asking permission to exist. He opened the door. The air was sharp enough to make him gasp. The lake buried in fog and glittering frost. The dog stepped outside, then turned back to look at him just once before padding into the snow. Elliot watched until the small shape vanished behind the drift. He stood there for a long time, one hand on the doorframe, the cold creeping in. When he finally went back to his chair, the house felt even quieter than before, but the quilt was still warm. He should have known it wasn't over, because that night, just as the moon rose over the lake like a pale coin, he heard it again, the same scratching at the door. Only this time, when he opened it, the dog didn't wait for an invitation. It walked right past him, shook the snow from its coat, and lay down on the same quilt as if it had always been his. Elliot chuckled under his breath, a sound so rusty it almost startled him. He said, "You again. Huh, guess I should call you something." He thought of a dozen names, Max. Buddy. Scout, but none fit the silence between them. Then he looked outside. The world beyond the glass was white and endless. The snow was falling again, slow and steady. The kind that never truly stops. He nodded softly. "Winter," he said. "That's your name." The dog lifted its head, eyes half open, as if it understood. Elliot smiled. "You look like a winter." He sat down beside the stove, feeding the fire until it glowed steady again. The warmth spread through the room, reaching corners that had been cold too long. For the first time in months, Elliot didn't think of graves or empty chairs or the quiet that had ruled his nights. His mind filled instead with the sound of paws against snow, of breathing that wasn't his own, of life returning in small, careful ways. That night, his dreams changed. No more cemeteries. No empty rooms echoing with her name. He dreamed of walking through a forest blanketed in white, of footsteps beside him. Light and sure. He didn't turn to look. He didn't need to. When he woke before dawn, the fire still whispered. And winter was still there, curled by the hearth, one paw twitching in sleep. Elliot listened to the breathing soft, rhythmic, alive, and felt a strange peace settle over him. Maybe it was the dog. Maybe it was something larger, older, written into the turning of seasons. But for the first time in a year, the cabin didn't feel empty. He leaned back, eyes half closed, and whispered, "All right then. Winter, stay the night. Outside." Snow fell against the roof, gentle, endless, and forgiving. Inside, a man and a dog dreamed in the same silence. And the world, for a brief moment, remembered how to be kind. The days began to fold into one another, slow as the drift of snow on the roof. Mornings used to arrive like intruders, harsh, uninvited, breaking through the blinds with a light too clean for grief. But now, they came gentler. Somehow, the sound of paws stretching on the wooden floor changed the way sunlight felt in the room. Winter had decided he was home. No ceremony, no question, just belonging, quiet, stubborn, certain. Each day, Elliot would open the door to the cold, and Winter would bound out first, leaving a scatter of paw prints on the steps before vanishing into the whiteness. He never went far. By the time Elliot reached the woodpile, the dog would already be there, tail wagging, eyes bright, as if to say, "We're doing this together." It felt strange, after so long, to be followed, to be expected, to be part of something's world again. The routine began to build itself, without plan. Elliot chopped wood. Winter watched, head tilted, ears twitching with every swing of the axe. When Elliot paused to catch his breath, the dog would drop a stick at his feet, as though offering a trade. "You keep me warm, I'll keep you company." And somehow, it worked. Back inside, the cabin began to smell like life again, wood smoke and broth, old wool and wet fur. Elliot would cook soup in the evenings, humming tunelessly as he stirred. At first, he'd make one bowl, out of habit. But the second night, he reached into the cupboard and took down another. He ladled broth and carrots into both, setting one on the floor by the stove. Winter lapped it up noisily, tail thumping against the floorboards. Elliot smiled, a real one, awkward, cracked at the edges. "Margaret used to scold me for feeding the strays," he murmured. "Said I'd never learned to say no." He looked at the dog and added, "Guess she was right." After dinner, he would sit in his chair with the fire breathing steady light into the room. Winter would curl nearby, paws tucked under, half asleep but listening. Elliot began to talk more, not because he expected an answer, but because silence no longer felt sacred. It felt safe. He'd tell stories the kind Margaret used to love, about the time the two of them built a canoe and it sank halfway across the lake. About the autumn he carved her a rocking chair that leaned a little to the left, but she refused to let him fix it because, she said, perfection is a kind of loneliness. The dog would lift his head sometimes, eyes half open, as if following along. Elliot laughed at that. "You're a good listener." Winter better than most. There were moments, in the middle of these talks, when Elliot would forget to guard himself. He'd catch a glimpse of her photo on the shelf and say her name aloud. Not in sorrow this time, but like a prayer you say out of love, not loss. Margaret, the word no longer cracked his voice. It soothed it. He noticed how winter mirrored his moods, how the dog grew calm when he was calm, alert when his thoughts grew restless. There was something ancient in that, a kind of unspoken rhythm between creatures who both knew the language of solitude. Each afternoon, they'd walk to the dock that stretched across the frozen lake. Elliot had avoided that place for months, too many memories carved into its planks. But winter trotted ahead, fearless, looking back only to make sure Elliot was following. The ice groaned beneath their boots, deep and distant. Wind swept across the surface, carrying whispers of pine from the far shore. Winter would run ahead, slide a little, and bark once, not loud, just enough to wake the quiet. Elliot found himself laughing again, a sound he hadn't made in so long that it startled him. It didn't feel wrong. It felt necessary. He spoke aloud, his voice carried by the cold air. Margaret used to say, "Every winter hides a heartbeat, if you listen long enough." He paused, listening, really listening to the faint rhythm of the lake beneath them. "I think I finally hear it," he whispered. When they returned home, the sun already leaning behind the ridge, Elliot lit the fire earlier than usual. He liked the way the shadows shifted, how the flame filled the room before darkness could. Winter would stretch by the hearth, sighing into the warmth. The ticking clock seemed slower now, patient. Some evenings, Elliot would carve small things out of wood, a bird, a tiny sled, a heart no bigger than his thumb. He didn't know why. Maybe the hands remember joy even when the mind forgets. Winter watched him work, occasionally resting his head on Elliot's boot, content to just exist beside him. It was a simple companionship one made, not of words but of presence. And yet, it was rewriting everything inside him. He no longer ate dinner because he had to, but because it marked the end of another shared day. He no longer counted hours, only moments, when winter looked at him with that quiet trust that says, "You're not invisible anymore." The cabin began to feel different too. Not larger, but lighter. The corners that used to hold only shadows now held warmth. The air carried traces of fur, fire, and soup, the scent of life continuing, unceremoniously, beautifully. Sometimes, as he watched the fire flicker, Elliot thought of Margaret again, but not as loss. He thought of how she would have smiled seeing this creature curled in her quilt. How she'd have said, "See, even grief needs someone to share the fire." He nodded to the empty chair across from him. "You were right. Love, you always were." Winter stirred, lifting his head. The dog's gaze caught the firelight, blue eyes reflecting gold. Elliot smiled. "Guess that makes you my teacher now." "Huh." The dog tilted his head, as if to agree. That night, snow fell again, slow and fine, the kind that glows in lamplight like dust from stars. Elliot sat by the window, Winter sleeping at his feet. He watched the flakes melt against the glass, leaving trails that faded quickly but not before shining. He realized then that life was like that, each moment small, temporary, gone before you could hold it, and yet somehow enough to light the dark. When he finally went to bed, he left the door to his room open for the first time since Margaret's passing. Winter followed him quietly, circling once before, curling beside the bed. Elliot lay there in the dim light, listening to the steady rhythm of two beings breathing in sync. It was such a simple sound, and yet it felt like music returning to a place that had forgotten how to sing. Before sleep took him, he whispered into the darkness, "Good night, winter, and thank you." Outside, the world kept snowing. Inside, the fire kept burning. And for the first time in a long, long while, Elliot Crane dreamed not of endings, but of warmth that never left. The warning came early that morning. The voice on the radio, distant. Hollow said the storm would be the worst in a decade. Stay indoors. The announcer urged, stock firewood. Keep lanterns ready. Travel is not advised. Elliot turned the volume down, though not soon enough to miss the tremor in the man's tone. He'd lived through many Vermont winters, but even the old ones had their limits. There was a particular stillness before a great storm, like the world holding its breath before the wind remembered its power. Outside, clouds gathered low and thick, the color of pewter. The lake disappeared into mist. The trees stood unmoving, waiting to bend. Elliot worked quietly. He brought in extra logs, stacked them by the hearth until the pile reached his knee. He checked the oil lamp, the candles, the kettle, the blankets. He moved slower than he used to, but the rhythm steadied him. Chop, carry, close, seal a ritual against helplessness. Winter followed him everywhere that morning. Tail lowered, eyes uneasy. He could sense something coming. Animals always could. He paced near the door, whining softly, pressing his nose to the cold glass as if testing the air for danger. Elliot crouched beside him, running a rough hand through the dog's thick fur. "It's just weather, boy. We'll be fine." But his voice didn't sound convincing, even to himself. By afternoon, the first flakes began to fall slow, fat, deliberate. Within minutes, they thickened into a white curtain, sweeping across the windows until the world outside became a blur. The sound was no longer gentle. It hissed, it whispered, it grew teeth. Elliot closed the shutters and latched the door. The house darkened, wrapped in the kind of silence that carries weight, not peace, but pressure. He lit the fire early, watched the flames twist and fight for air. Winter wouldn't settle. He paced from door to window, back and forth, nails clicking on the floorboards, tail stiff. "Easy," Elliot murmured. "It's just wind." But when the gusts hit the house, they howled like something alive. The chimney moaned. Snow forced its way through the smallest cracks. Outside, the trees creaked and groaned, ancient things struggling not to break. Winter barked once, sharp and startled. Then again. Elliot rose, heart quickening. He crossed to the door, pressing a hand to the handle. The cold burned through the metal. He opened it just enough to look out. White. Nothing but white, a living, shifting wall of snow. And then, before he could stop him, Winter slipped through the opening and vanished into it. A blur of motion, a streak of fur, gone between one breath and the next. "Winter," Elliot shouted, the word torn from his chest. He stepped outside, the wind hitting him like a body. "Winter, come back, boy." But his voice was stolen. The storm devoured every sound, every shape, every trace of life. He could barely see the porch, barely feel his own hands. Snow bit into his face, stung his eyes, filled his mouth when he tried to call again. Winter. Nothing. Just the endless, white roar of the storm. Elliot stumbled back inside, slamming the door against the wind. He leaned against it, breathing hard. The warmth of the fire already felt far away. He whispered, "Oh, God, no." For the first time in months, the house felt haunted again, not by memories this time, but by fear. Real, raw, immediate fear. He grabbed his coat, his boots, the lantern. The flame flickered, weak and nervous, but he didn't care. He opened the door again, took one step out, then stopped. The snow was waist-deep already. The wind screamed like 1,000 voices. He could barely see past his hand. To go after the dog now would mean losing them both. He closed the door again, slowly, as if sealing himself inside a tomb. The next hours bled into night. The storm beat against the walls like a desperate thing, trying to get in. Elliot fed the fire, one log at a time, each flame rising only to shudder and bow. He sat in the chair, coat still on, eyes fixed on the door. Every gust that rattled the hinges made his heart lurch. He whispered the name again and again, as if saying it enough times could guide the dog back through the snow. Winter, winter. But the storm didn't care. It roared louder, drowning everything human. By midnight, the house was a different world, half dark, half light. Fire breathing in gasps. The windows pulsed with shadows of branches whipping in the wind. Somewhere, deep inside the chimney, air moaned like an old instrument. He couldn't sleep. He barely blinked. He imagined the dog out there, lost among drifts taller than fences, eyes wide, paws bleeding, calling for him in a voice no one could hear. He whispered to the air, "Don't stop fighting, boy. Just hold on, please." Outside, the world howled in answer. By dawn, the storm showed no sign of mercy. He had to keep feeding the fire or it would die. And if the fire died, so would he. His body ached from the cold, from worry, from stillness. Every hour felt like a day. Every gust, another memory of something he'd already lost once before. Margaret's face drifted before him in the flames. Her voice calm, certain whispered through memory, "Don't shut the world out." Elliot, even the cold brings meaning. He stared at the fire, eyes burning. "He was all I had left," he said to the silence. But the silence didn't answer. The storm went on through the night. Relentless, merciless. Snow buried the porch. The lake disappeared completely. The trees now only pale ghosts against a churning sky. Time stopped having edges. He dozed, sitting up, lantern beside him, waking every few minutes to the sound of something or maybe nothing moving outside. By the second day, the wind began to tire. The pounding softened to a long, low sigh. The house creaked, stretched, exhaled. Elliot pushed open the door just a crack. The air that entered was sharp and clean, a silence so deep it rang in the ears. The storm had passed, but the world outside was buried, every fence, every path erased. The snow reached the windowsills. The trees wore crowns of ice. Elliot stood there, staring at the emptiness, heart heavy with dread. Somewhere out there, beneath that endless white, was the only living thing that had dared to love him again. He whispered one last time, his breath trembling in the cold, "Winter, I'm coming, boy." He reached for his coat and lantern, his boots crunching on the frozen floor. The fire still burned behind him, the last echo of safety in a world remade by snow. And as he stepped outside into that white silence, the story shifted again from loss to search, to the fragile hope that maybe love, even once lost to the storm, still finds its way home. By dawn, the world had gone still again. The storm had passed, but not gently. It had erased everything. The lake, the trees, the paths all swallowed beneath a white so endless it made the sky seem close enough to touch. Elliot stood in the doorway, lantern in hand, the glass still fogged from his breath. The silence outside was vast, the kind that hums softly inside your bones, like an echo that's lost its source. He stepped out. The snow reached his knees, crusted in layers of glittering ice. Each step broke the surface with a muted crunch. The sound swallowed before it could travel. The cold bit at his beard, his fingers, the corners of his eyes. He raised the lantern higher. The small flame flickered weakly, painting his shadow onto the snow. He called out once softly, almost afraid to break the stillness. Winter. Nothing answered. Only the distant creak of a pine bowing under the weight of too much beauty. He walked toward the lake, where the wind had swept the snow thin. The surface was glass hard, frozen, unbroken. He had expected paw prints. He had expected anything, but the storm had cleaned the world too well. He stood there a long time, the lantern shaking in his hand, the emptiness pressed close. Heavy as grief, he thought of Margaret, then her voice, calm even when the world was not. Promise me, Elliot, don't disappear just because I did. He remembered how he'd nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and how, after she was gone, he'd done exactly that, disappeared without moving an inch. He looked across the frozen lake, the line of trees fading into mist. He whispered, I broke that promise once. I won't again. Then he started walking. Every few steps, he paused to listen for barking, for movement, for hope. The only sound was the soft hiss of wind over the drifts, like the world whispering secrets he couldn't quite catch. He searched near the dock first, then the slope behind the cabin. The snow clung to his boots, heavy and wet. The lantern's flame danced, throwing small halos of gold into a sea of white. He spoke aloud, not for the dog, but for himself. Come on, boy. You've got more fight than this. His voice trembled. You always did. He walked until the muscles in his legs ached, until the breath came in visible clouds that hung for a moment before fading. Still nothing. He passed the line of pines that marked the old boundary of their property. Beyond that was the forest deep, dark, unmapped. Margaret used to tell him never to go too far after snowstorms. The world looks kind when it's white. She'd say, but kindness can kill if you trust it too much. He smiled faintly at the memory, even as his chest tightened with cold. Well, he murmured, you were right about that too. The forest stood quiet. Branches bowed low, their weight groaning softly like old men in prayer. He lifted the lantern higher, its glow brushing the trunks with amber light. And they're faint, delicate, half buried. He saw a mark, a paw print, small, nearly erased, but real. He knelt, brushing the snow away with shaking hands. Another print, a few feet ahead. Then another, a faint trail. weaving between trees, leading deeper into the woods. "Good boy," he whispered. "You kept moving." He followed, step by step, lantern swinging. The prince grew harder to see as snow drifted down from the branches. But he kept his eyes fixed forward. His breath came out in ragged bursts. His body ached. But the ache meant he was still here, still trying. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It felt like walking through a dream, one where time forgot its direction. He thought about the day he'd found Winter, that trembling shape on the porch. Those eyes that had met his without fear. It had been the first time in months that anything had looked at him as if he still existed. He realized now that he wasn't searching for the dog alone. He was searching for the part of himself that had answered that gaze. He whispered to the silence, "You found me once, Winter. Let me find you now." Hours slipped by. Though he no longer counted them, the lantern's flame had shrunk to a trembling pin of light. His legs were numb. His breath burned in his chest. But the trail led him onward, one paw print, then another. He came to a small clearing where the trees leaned inward, forming a fragile shelter. The snow there was less deep, disturbed, shaped by movement. He lifted the lantern, the light spilling softly across the ground, and for a moment, he thought he saw something. A flicker of gray, a curve of fur half buried beneath the drift. He stumbled forward, dropping to his knees. It wasn't a dream. It was real. But as he reached out, his heart stopped. The body was still. No breath, no sound, just silence. Too great, his voice broke, rough as stone. "No, no, boy." He brushed the snow away, desperate, trembling, and then a twitch, the faintest movement, a sigh of air against his hand. Alive. He let out a sound that wasn't quite a sob, wasn't quite laughter, something raw. In between, he gathered the small body into his arms. The fur was cold, but not frozen. The eyes fluttered, unfocused but open. "You did it," he whispered. "You made it through." He pressed his face into the dog's neck, breathing in the faint, wild scent of pine and snow. The lantern light flickered across both of them, fragile but steady. Elliot looked around the endless white, the quiet trees, the gray sky softening toward dawn. And for the first time since the storm began, the world didn't feel cruel. It felt vast, like a place that had seen everything and forgiven most of it. He stood slowly, holding Winter close. The dog stirred weakly, one paw resting against his coat. Elliot whispered, "Let's go home, boy. We've both wandered long enough." He turned back toward the lake, following the dim orange glow that meant the cabin was still standing. Behind him, the trail of paw prints filled slowly with snow, fading as he walked. Ahead, the lantern light pushed a small circle of warmth into the endless cold. Every step hurt, but every step mattered. He was no longer just surviving the winter. He was walking through it carrying life, carrying love, carrying the proof that neither had left him completely. As he neared the open slope, he looked up. The clouds were breaking. A pale, bruised sunlight touched the horizon, gold spilling softly across the ice. He whispered into the new light, "Thank you, Margaret. You were right. The world still has heartbeats in it, and beneath that vast, quiet sky." He kept walking, a man and a dog, small against the white, but no longer lost. The light was changing, not quite morning, not yet night. That's strange. Silver hour, when the world forgets what it is. The forest was quiet again, but not with peace, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm. When everything is listening to what remains. Elliot's breath came ragged and white, rising in small clouds that vanished as quickly as they formed. He'd been walking for hours, though he could no longer tell by the sun. The sky was a blur of soft gray, and the snow beneath him no longer had edges, only folds. Waves. A white ocean that went on forever. His legs were trembling. His hands ached from gripping the lantern too long. But still, he kept calling. Winter, his voice cracked on the name. Half prayer, half command. Only the forest answered, each echo smaller than the last. He was ready to believe the worst when something flickered at the edge of his sight. A movement barely there near the line of trees ahead. He stopped, heart pounding hard enough to feel in his throat. There, between the snow-laden branches, lay a shape, a patch of gray against white. Still, silent. Elliot moved toward it, the lantern swinging low, his boots breaking the crusted snow with slow, desperate care. When he reached the shape, he dropped to his knees. It was Winter. The dog lay half buried, one paw pinned beneath a fallen branch, fur matted with ice. For a moment, Elliot couldn't move, his breath caught, his vision blurred with tears he hadn't meant to cry. He touched the dog's neck, cold, but not gone. There was a heartbeat, faint, fragile. But there, oh, you foolish boy, he whispered, voice trembling. You came back for me. Winter stirred, eyes opening just enough to meet his gaze. They were dull now, but still that same blue, the color of cold skies and deep water. The dog gave a weak whine. More breath than sound. Elliot's throat closed. I've got you, he said softly. We're going home. He pushed the branch away, wincing at the effort, then wrapped his coat around the dog's trembling body. The warmth of the fur bled slowly into his chest. He could feel the faint rise and fall against him life, stubborn and small, refusing to go. He lifted Winter in his arms. The weight was heavier than he expected, not because of size, but because of everything that moment carried: fear, relief, the sharp ache of realizing how much he needed what he'd almost lost. The forest seemed to lean closer around them, the trees bowing under their snow, forming a narrow passage toward home. The lantern light flickered over their faces, man and dog, shadows moving together through the white silence. Each step was a battle. The snow was deep, the ground uneven, and his legs felt hollow with exhaustion. But the thought of the cabin, the fire waiting, the small space that had become their world, pulled him forward like gravity. He spoke softly as he walked, half to keep himself awake, half because words were all he had left to give. You scared me. Boy, you really did. You've got no idea how quiet that house gets without you in it. He laughed under his breath, a sound cracked by cold. I thought I'd gotten used to silence, but I was wrong. Turns out it's worse when it comes back. Winter gave a faint sound, not quite a bark, not quite a sigh. Elliot smiled. That's right. You tell me off. I deserve it. The snow kept falling, softer now, almost gentle flakes catching in his beard, in the dog's fur, melting where warmth still lived. The world seemed to narrow to the circle of light around them. The sound of his boots, the rhythm of two hearts, trying to find their way back to safety. He thought of Margaret again, but not in pain this time. He thought of the way she used to put her hand over his when he worked steadying. Wordless. Sure. And he thought, you'd laugh at me now. Wouldn't you, an old fool, carrying a dog through a blizzard like he's carrying the world? Somewhere inside him, her voice answered not in words, but in feeling, a warmth, a knowing, a whisper that said, keep walking. Elliot, you're doing it right this time. He kept walking. When he finally reached the open field near the lake, the cabin appeared through the mist, a dark, familiar shape in a sea of white. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, like a signal of hope he hadn't dared expect. He hadn't even remembered leaving the fire burning. But maybe love had kept watch in his absence. He staggered to the porch, the last few steps breaking something open inside him. He didn't feel the cold anymore. He didn't feel his own weight. Only the pulse of the living thing in his arms. Inside, the air was still warm. The fire had dimmed, but not died. He laid Winter gently on the quilt by the hearth, tucking the coat around him. The dog's breathing was shallow, but steady. Elliot sat beside him, feeding the fire until it blazed again. Orange light washed over the room, chasing away the shadows, painting life back into everything. He looked down at the dog and said softly, you made it home. Guess we both did. Winter blinked, eyes reflecting the flame. Elliot smiled through tears that surprised him. Sometimes, he said, voice breaking, the ones we save are the ones who save us. He sat there for a long time, his hand resting on the dog's back, feeling the small rise and fall, the heartbeat that matched his own. Outside, the world was still, the lake frozen, the wind quiet, the snow catching light from the window like scattered stars. He realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the past or what he'd lost. He was here fully, fiercely, gratefully here, alive, needed, accompanied. The fire popped, sparks rising like tiny prayers. Winter stirred, letting out a soft groan, then rested his head on Elliot's knee. Elliot chuckled low. You're a stubborn creature. You know that. He leaned back in the chair, body heavy with relief, eyes half closed. The storm outside had broken him open, but what returned in its wake wasn't just calm, it was meaning. It was the realization that love doesn't die when the world goes quiet. It just waits patient, hidden until something calls it back. He thought of Margaret's scarf in the basket, unfinished. He imagined picking it up again tomorrow, with Winter lying at his feet. The room filled with that quiet hum of living. Maybe he'd finish it after all, not for her to wear, but for what she'd left behind in him, the part that still believed in warmth, in small miracles, in the quiet persistence of care. Outside, snow fell again, softer now, peaceful. The storm was gone, but the memory of it would stay a reminder that even the fiercest cold eventually yields to light. Elliot looked down at Winter, who was already asleep. Breathing slow and deep, he whispered, rest easy. Boy, you did good. We both did. He leaned back, the fire painting gold across the walls, and closed his eyes. The house was no longer hollow. It was full of breath, of warmth, of presence. And somewhere inside that quiet, something ancient and tender stirred a truth he'd almost forgotten, that every love, no matter how small, no matter how broken, has the power to lead us home. The lantern beside the door flickered once, caught a final glint of flame, and steadied. The night deepened, soft and blue, and in that cabin by the frozen lake, a man and a dog slept beside the fire, their hearts still beating, their silence finally at peace. Winter healed the way snow melts in late March, quietly, without announcements, one drop at a time. In the mornings he rose slowly, favoring the mended paw, testing the floorboards like a careful dancer, relearning his steps. By noon he was moving more freely, shadowing Elliot from room to room, settling wherever the old man settled, making a map of the day out of companionship. By evening, he was back to curling beside the hearth, content to keep watch over the fire and the man who had carried him home. The cabin changed with him. Some houses respond to people the way trees respond to light. They lean toward warmth, as if their very beams soften. The corners no longer felt like places where shadows hid. They felt like the gentle edges of a life being used again. The kettle grew familiar with singing. The table earned a few new knife marks. Fresh wood, stacked against the wall, gave off that clean, resin-laced promise of heat. And the idle chair, the one opposite Elliot's, stopped being a shrine to loneliness and became instead the place where a dog would rest his chin on the seat, waiting to be told he was a good boy. On the first Sunday after the storm, Elliot stepped onto the porch with a hammer and a box of old nails. The railing had loosened over winter, and one board sagged where snow had found its own stubborn way in. He measured by eye, the way he always had, and began to work. The rhythm was old, beloved hammer. Breath, hammer. Breath, the small percussion of a man returning to himself. Winter lay nearby, a patch of gray and white in the pale sun. Ears pricking each time a nail found wood with a satisfied bite. Elliot hummed as he worked. Not a song he knew, more like a tune picked up from the wind. The melody wasn't pretty, but it was gentle, and it was honest. An old melody, because he was an old man, moving carefully through new days. Word travels strangely in quiet places. Smoke became his messenger. It lifted from the chimney each afternoon, threading through the cold air like a letter in a language the whole valley could read. Neighbors who had only seen stillness for months now saw a dark ribbon of proof. And they told one another, in passing, that the Crane place was breathing again. One woman from 2 coves over said she felt grateful and couldn't say why. An old farmer delivering feed to the far ridge thought about stopping in. He did not, but he planned to. The world had noticed the small flame and decided to keep it company. On a Tuesday, as snow blew sideways in soft sheets, the mailwoman came by sturdy boots, red scarf, eyes bright from the crisp air. She knocked with the cheerful efficiency of someone who lives in all weather and prefers a good road, but will make do with the one God gives. Elliot opened the door and felt winter's bite climb up his sleeves. She handed him a small bundle of letters and 2 catalogs he'd never ordered. "Good to see the chimney again," she said. Smile quick and sincere. Winter pressed his nose to her glove, tail tapping the doorframe like a polite metronome. She laughed and scratched behind his ear. "And good to see you. Handsome." The dog closed his eyes gratefully. And for a moment, Elliot watched a stranger love his dog and understood how the world heals, not in speeches, but in small, shared gladness. After she left, he stood at the window a little longer than necessary, watching her footprints fill with blowing snow. He felt the soft tug of the empty room behind him and the warmer tug of the breathing presence at his feet. The letters waited on the table. He made tea, opened one, and found a flyer from the town hardware store. He smiled at the banality of it, at how ordinary life felt marvelous now, as if the price of hinges could be a blessing. When the tea was gone and the light had thinned to that pewter hour that belongs solely to winter, Elliot sat at the table with a pen. It had been months since he'd written to his daughter without apology. Words used to come out of him like water from a faucet left open. Then grief twisted the valve, and everything reduced to a thread. Now they arrived steady, thoughtfully, each one given a place to rest on the page. He told her about the storm, about the dog who had chosen them both. He told her that he was eating well again, nothing fancy, but the soup tastes like kindness, and that the porch no longer sagged. He told her the truth that he still missed her mother every morning. But the missing had changed shape. It no longer sounded like a door closing. It sounded like a familiar voice calling from the other room, not asking him to follow, only inviting him to live the day he'd been given. At the bottom of the page he wrote, with a small, almost embarrassed smile, "Tell the grandkids their grandpa isn't as alone as he looks." He set down the pen and read the line twice, because saying it made it more real, and because reality can sometimes be tender enough to require a little courage. He sealed the envelope with hands that shook a bit, less from age than from the simple astonishment of hope. Days found a gentle pattern. In the mornings, Elliot split wood with measured patience, each wedge clean and satisfying. Winter learned to sit just far enough away to avoid flying chips, close enough to be an audience. At midday they shared a sandwich bread thick with butter, a sliver of cheese for each, the dog accepting his portion with a solemn dignity that made Elliot laugh. In the afternoons they walked down to the lake, stopping at the place where the dock met the ice. Winter's mended paw touched down carefully, the prints gathering like a line of small, loyal promises. They never wandered too far. They had learned what distance can do. Sometimes, on the way home, Elliot would talk to Margaret, not in the old way that begged the air for answers, but in the new way, simple, conversational. The way you address a friend who has stepped into the next room and will return when supper is ready. "You should see him now," he'd say. "He's figured out how to fake that limp when he wants extra supper." You'd spoil him rotten. A moment later he'd add, "You did tell me I was too soft." The ache that followed was sweet and manageable, like a muscle warming after a long winter's rest. The cabin gained a new music. Winter snored in soft puffs, a sound like pages turning. The clock took on a friendlier tick, less insistent, more companionable. The kettle learned to sing again at dusk, and Elliot, without noticing when it began, started humming real songs, the old ones from the radio, or the hymn his mother used to murmur while folding linen, "Be thou my vision," remembered in pieces, the melody wandering and then finding itself again. When his voice wavered, Winter lifted his head as if to keep time. It is a curious thing to be kept in rhythm by another creature's attention. He felt steady because the dog believed he was steady. In the quiet of evening, Elliot grew brave enough to take Margaret's poetry book down from its ledge. The spine cracked the way leather does when it's been waiting a long while, and the dust rose with the solemnity of a curtain. He opened to the page she had dog-eared. He didn't need to. He could have found it blind and began to read. He did not read for eloquence. He read the way you read to a child who already loves you plainly, as if the words were warm bread, Some of the lines snagged his breath. Some passed over him like hands smoothing a wrinkled sheet. Winter's ears flicked sleepily at the softer phrases. And when Elliot paused, the dog gave a low sound that might have been a sigh or might have been approval. Either way, it was enough. Love doesn't end. Winter, Elliot said at last, closing the book against his chest. It just changes address. He wasn't sure if he was quoting or writing something new on top of something old. But the sentence felt right in his mouth. He looked at the photograph on the mantel, Margaret's laugh halfway to happening, and felt no stab. Only a thinning of the distance between rooms. He repeated the line quietly, as if practicing it for someone who might ask later how he managed. Love doesn't end. It just changes address. His voice did not crack. It grew warm. There were visitors sometimes. Not the kind that stay long. Winter towns know the price of lingering, but the kind that barter kindness for a moment of porch talk. The farmer from the far ridge kept his intention and brought a jug of cider he swore was non-alcoholic, and clearly wasn't. They stood in the doorway and drank it in small sips, while Winter leaned against both of them like a diplomat. The farmer squinted at the repaired railing and said, "Straight as a sermon." Elliot laughed and said, "Crooked as a life. But it holds." They both seemed satisfied with that attempt at truth. Other days, no one came. Those were good days. Too, the quiet felt earned, not imposed. Elliot learned again the old comfort of simple chores done well, mending a glove, oiling a hinge, writing a list for the next trip to town and then forgetting the list and going anyway. He discovered that soup tastes different when you expect to tell someone later how well it turned out. He noticed how the snow on the woodpile looked like frosting, and how the light at 4 o'clock had a mercy to it. Even in January, letters went out each week. And then, miraculously, letters came back. His daughter wrote of the grandkids' spelling tests and missing front teeth, and the goldfish who'd lived 3 funerals and was now named Phoenix. She asked careful questions, the kind grown children ask when they want to honor a parent's dignity. Are you warm enough? Do you need anything? She suggested a visit when the roads improved. Elliot read each line twice. Once as a man, once as a father, and then tucked the paper under the sugar tin where his important things lived. He wrote again that night, signing as he had before, letting the sentence do its humble work. Tell the grandkids their grandpa isn't as alone as he looks. When the moon was clear and the night dry, Elliot sometimes stepped onto the porch with Winter and breathed the kind of cold that scours the lungs clean. Stars glittered as if someone had sprinkled salt over black velvet. He remembered being young enough to believe a sky like that meant something personal. Now, older, he believed it again. Winter sat close enough that their shoulders touched. The dog's fur held the day's warmth. Elliot felt a private gratitude rise in him. Steady and uncomplicated gratitude for wood that splits, for soup that simmers, for a creature who sleeps without doubt at the foot of a bed. Inside, the ceremony of evening became beloved. Fire banked, lamp trimmed, book opened, words spoken into a room that received them. Winter curled by the hearth in a shape that promised morning. Elliot read slowly, savoring the way vowels stretch when you give them time, the way consonants click like beads. When a line pleased him, he read it again. When a line hurt, he read it softer, and the hurt eased. That's what language is for in the good years, not to impress, but to accompany. And when the last page closed and the flame settled to a gentle crouch, he would lay his hand on Winter's neck, feeling the low, steady thrum beneath the fur. There it was, the heartbeat Margaret had promised him Winters would keep if he only listened long enough. It sounded like gratitude. It sounded like tomorrow. Love doesn't end. Winter, he said once more, almost smiling it now. It just changes address. The dog's tail brushed the floor twice, as if punctuating the sentence with approval. Elliot watched the fire fold into embers and felt the old season inside him do the same, still warm, still lighted from within, no longer raging, no longer afraid. Weeks had passed. The snow had not promised to leave, but the days had learned to shine through it. Smoke traced its familiar script above the roof. Footprints connected the porch to the woodpile and back again. The pattern of a life resumed. Somewhere down the road, the mailwoman told a friend that the man by the lake was all right. In town, someone who had not thought of him in years thought of him fondly. In the cabin, a man and a dog reclined in the generous hush that follows mercy. The night gathered gently around the windows. The clock kept honest time. The house breathed as houses do when they know who belongs to them. And in that close circle of firelight, the old carpenter put the book away, whispered goodnight to a wife who had never truly left, and to a dog who had shown him why, and let his eyes close. Not from fatigue, but from trust. Spring doesn't arrive all at once in Vermont. It tiptoes in shy, uncertain, testing the world with a single droplet of melted snow, then another, and another, until one morning, the lake sighs. The ice gives way with a sound like glass, remembering it was once water. Elliot hears it before he sees it that deep. Resonant cracking that travels through the air like thunder, softened by forgiveness. He steps outside and feels the change before he understands it. The wind smells different. It carries mud, pine, and the faint sweetness of things about to bloom. Winter runs ahead, paws splashing through shallow puddles where snow once ruled. His fur, darker now from the wet, glistens in the sun. He moves with a kind of joy that has no words, the joy of something that never expected warmth again. Finding it anyway, Elliot walks slowly down to the lake's edge. The ground soft beneath his boots. He leans on the stick he carries more out of habit than need. The sky above is still pale, but the light has changed, no longer distant, no longer cold. He picks up a small branch from the thawing shore, smooths it with his thumb, and tosses it gently into the water. It lands with a quiet splash. Winter hesitates for a heartbeat, then bounds forward, tail high, body strong, joy bursting through every movement. Elliot laughs. A low, unguarded sound. It's not the laughter of a man remembering the past, but of one entirely present, alive in a world that's finally decided to forgive him for surviving. He watches the dog chase the stick, paws sending ripples across the lake's thin skin of melting ice. When Winter turns back, branch in mouth, fur dripping, Elliot kneels to take it, his hands steady now, his heart open. "Good boy," he says softly. "You found it." Winter drops the stick and shakes, scattering droplets into sunlight. Elliot closes his eyes as they touch his face, cool, pure, alive. He looks around. The cabin stands a little weathered but proud, chimney trailing a lazy ribbon of smoke. The porch glows faintly with the color of sanded pine, the handiwork of a man who has remembered how to care for what he loves. The world feels wider again, but not empty. He thinks of Margaret not as absence, but as presence, diffused through everything gentle. The glint of light on the water, the warmth of the sun on his hands, the sound of the dog breathing beside him. Love, he realizes, is not a single form. It is migration. It moves. It adapts. It returns wearing new faces. He sits down on a smooth stone near the shore, watching the ice drift away in slow, shining fragments. Winter lies beside him, head resting on his knee. Elliot's hand finds the soft fur automatically. He speaks quietly, as he often does when no one else is near enough to answer. Maybe we never stop missing the ones we lose, he says. The words hang there for a moment, soft as the breeze. But sometimes, he continues, the universe sends us a companion not to replace what we lost, but to remind us why we loved in the first place. Winter stirs, pressing closer. Elliot smiles. Yeah, you know about that, don't you? They stay there a while, man and dog, surrounded by the faint music of water finding itself again. Somewhere, a bird tries out its first song of the season. The air feels almost kind. Elliot takes a deep breath and lets it out slowly, watching the mist fade into sunlight. He no longer counts the days by what they lack, but by what they bring. A letter from his daughter waiting on the table, the promise of company in the spring thaw, and beside him, a heartbeat that reminds him he's not done yet. He looks toward the line of hills beyond the lake, their tops still crusted with snow. He thinks of all the winters behind him, all the storms survived. He thinks of how many times he mistook stillness for ending. Now he understands even frozen things have motion inside them. They're just waiting for the right warmth to let go. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of pine needles and wet bark. Elliot stands, stretching slowly. He picks up the stick again and throws it farther this time. Winter bolts after it, snow spraying beneath his paws. The sound is joy, pure and simple. Elliot watches until the dog disappears into the light, until all that's left is the laughter he didn't realize was his own. And in that moment, the last of the winter inside him begins to thaw. He walks back toward the cabin, each step easy now. The world seems to hum again, faint, living, full. The door waits open, the fire low but steady. He glances back once more at the lake. The ice is almost gone. The water moves freely, bright and endless, carrying reflections of sky, of trees, of a man who has finally forgiven the season for being long. Elliot whispers to the quiet, "Thank you." He doesn't specify who he's thanking. He doesn't need to. The world knows. As he disappears into the warm light of the cabin, Winter trots beside him, branch in mouth, tail waving like a small, stubborn flag of life. Maybe we never stop missing the ones we lose, but sometimes the universe sends us a companion not to replace what we lost, but to remind us why we loved in the first place. If this story warmed your heart tonight, share it with someone who might need a little light in their winter. And remember, companionship doesn't always bark. Sometimes it just waits quietly by the door.